We've all been transported to worlds beyond our wildest imagination with books. But books are also a great vehicle to get together and exchange ideas. Welcome to Books du Jour. Come and join our authors at the table. Well, his name is not James Bond, but he may as well be. His name is Mike Bond, and his new book, Holy War. So, Holy War, we cover the two towers that got bombed and killed a few hundred soldiers, French and American, back in was it back mid-80s, I believe?
Yeah, 1983.
Yeah, 83.
Right.
And then, so the book is based around that, and it's a story of...
Well, what happened is I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, Frederic, and I have a particular passion for the Middle East, and when I was very young, I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in Islamic cultures. I got very interested in the Quran, and I ended up in Beirut prior to the 6 Days War, and then was going into the Sinai for the 6 Days War, and came back to Beirut afterwards numerous times. But in late 1970s, the religious wars in Lebanon broke out due to a number of reasons that had nothing to do with Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So I ended up back there after. What happened is we had the U.S. Marines in one base and the French paratroopers in another, and all we were doing is peacekeeping. Mm-hmm. And both places got bombed by garbage truck bombers, suicide bombers, and so then the question was who did it and how do we get them? And I ended up...
and it was with Hezbollah at the end, right?
I went over there to try to find the answer as to who was responsible, and I was in and out of a number of the different war zones of Lebanon in the 1980s and early 90s, and I put them together in Holy War, which is basically the story about the beauty of what was once the most beautiful city in the world, Beirut, and this magnificent culture, this Phoenician culture, the thousands of years of beautiful, beautiful culture, all destroyed. And I tried to write the real, true story about it, and that was Holy War.
It's interesting. It's a pure coincidence, but this morning we had Raymond Corey.
Yes,
you know him?
I know Raymond Corey.
And he's from Lebanon.
Yes.
And he was telling us about 1983. He had to escape with a helicopter on the beach overnight, like that.
Right,
you know?
right. Yeah.
And it's the same time, some era. I have a hard time. You've done so much. So it's more like there's a lot of hyphens between what you do. I mean, you've been CEO of energy companies, and you've been a journalist, and you were in Nicaragua during the Sandinista. I mean, how did you get to be exposed to all those places? I mean, not the right time, but the moment where everything seemed to be falling down to pieces.
It's a good question, and basically, Frederic, what would happen is I would make enough money in the straight world, if you wish, to go back and do what I loved, which was war journalism, not because I love war, I hate war, and human rights journalism because I'm very preoccupied with the fate of those who have no voice. And I try to speak for those who have no voice, whether it's the 2 million displaced Guatemalans displaced by the U.S. military dictatorships in Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador, or the horrible things that have happened in Africa. That I don't seek out these places. I seek them out because I want the people there to have a voice. I want to be able to tell the truth because history so often is a lie. I want, and this is desperately deep in my own heart, I want to tell the truth. And
But how does that work? So you call the Reuters or AP agency, say I'm going to go there, would you like me to do some coverage, or you just buy your own ticket and get there?
I just buy my own ticket and get there because I don't want to be hooked into anybody's system, and then I write about it afterwards. And I find that, like in Guatemala, for instance, that I had no trouble selling my stories to U.S. papers, and I couldn't back in those days. You called in a story by telephone, and some poor girl who was chewing gum while she listened to you was typing down your story, or you waited till you got back safe, and then you typed it up and you sent it. But I never had any trouble selling my stories because what counts is the story, not the writer. And the story is the truth. The story is what deeply happens in these places and what we need to know about in order to better understand our world. I don't know if that's a good answer, Frederic.
No, but it's not good or right answer. It's just your answer is the right answer.
Yeah.
But so you were born in Texas,
Yes.
right? And then you seem to have acquired the French language very well, and better than you can speak it. You know.
Yeah.
How does that happen? I mean, and then that,
Well, it happened because I was born in Texas only because my father was in the military, headed overseas to fight in the Second World War, which he did with great credit and numerous medals and incredible courage.
with the American Army.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And so as a teenager, I got pretty sick and tired of college because nothing was happening. And I'd been, at that point, done a lot of serious mountain climbing. And so I was used to danger. And I found sitting in a classroom extremely boring.
I can imagine, yes.
And so I left college and drove a truck for a while and made enough money to go to France and lived in France and got tired of France, and not tired of France, one will never be tired of France, but I wanted adventure, so I went to the Sahara and everything. But
And you ended up being there during the Algerian War at the end of it.
Yes, I was in the Algerian War at the end, and now you've touched on a very interesting subject here.
Yes, indeed. So you were like, you were on the Algerian side or the French side, or where were you?
I wanted to understand. And I spent a lot of time with the Algerian freedom fighters, as they call themselves, and I spent a lot of time with the French forces, and I spent some time with the French Foreign Legion, and I just wanted them to stop killing each other because they were all wonderful people. And to this day, I have my reservation. The Algerian Revolution, as it was called, was largely funded by the Soviets, and unfortunately so, because I still think to this day that a closer link between Algeria and France would be beneficial for both countries. And so I have been accepted and loved by, and have loved both cultures, the Islamic culture as well as, and I am deeply French and all the way down to the roots of my heart. And
I mean, we can talk about Algeria ad nauseum and your feeling about it, and then we see what's happening in Russia, especially in Ukraine.
Yes.
There was a flavor, like, is it really a war of independence, or is it really an energy war?
Right.
Given this pipeline they're trying to build. What's your take on that? Because you've been both places, you seem to know the energy problem situation in Russia very well. And then you went in Algeria, which is loaded with oil.
Yeah, I also speak Russian, and I've spent a lot of time in Russia, and before the wall came down, and since the wall came down. And it's a very complicated question because Russia needs ports to the south. Access to the south. It's a very hard question because if a vast majority in an area wants to be associated with one nation and are naturally speakers of that language, though Ukrainian and Russian are not that far behind.
No.
And
a few letters here and there,
I'm concerned about Putin, Vladimir Putin. I think that in many ways he's done some good things, but the latest things that are happening in Russia are insane. Like girls can't wear lace, they can't wear high heels, they can't wear, short skirts. I mean, that's right out of Islam. And so I love Russia very much. I'm extremely fond of Russia, and I'm concerned about where they're going. And Ukraine, if Ukraine wants to be part of the European community, it should be part of the European community. For thousands of years, Ukraine has been glued to Russia, at the hip. And I think that it's time. And Russia likes the Ukraine because it's a huge buffer zone, a military buffer zone. And by the time the Germans got finished with the Ukraine, the Russians could deal with them. I think if 80–90% of a region wants to be part of Russia and speaks Russian naturally, fine, but it's got to be open elections. So I'm concerned, and I don't have a clear answer. And I think Ukraine has a right to its own territory, and I think Ukraine and Russia both. Another big mistake, we Americans, we never think far enough back in history. I was saying this in the panel I was in today, that it's all very fine to say, for instance, Iran is a big problem. But in 1954, the United States and the CIA threw over the elected government of Iran. And ever since we've had...
the Shah.
When we put this little idiot who was a private in the army and called him the Shah, which is an ancient word meaning powerful leader, we started we opened a Pandora's box that led to the '79 takeover of our,
Khomeini,
you know, so when we get mad at the Iranians today, and this is an ancient, magnificent culture, this was
Persian culture is very rich.
yeah, and it's a culture that my ancestors in France and Ireland were still picking their teeth with cave bear bones, you know, these guys were writing books and had libraries and waterfalls and cities and everything else. So I think with many cultures, we make the same problem if we don't look at our own history before we decide where we stand with them. And I think that's true of Russia too. The Obama administration has totally fouled up our relations with Russia, sadly, very sadly, because we could have had much closer relations. And I think the European Union, I think that Russia should be part of the European Union also. And I've worked for the European Commission, so
Yeah,
I see it very, in fact, I back in my energy days, I was the chairman of a group of 28 nations that tried to link up the Soviet electricity grid with Western Europe, and so I have many Russian friends that whom I respect highly. And if you talk about great literature, you're talking Russia. The two greatest,
Sure.
well, Russia and France, to my mind, are the two greatest literatures in the world.
I would agree, to some extent.
Yeah.
Russia just did this massive energy deal with China.
Yeah.
You know, so it seems like there's a big geopolitical games going on as well.
Yes. Right.
When back in your, I don't know what year you're talking about when you say you were part of the CEO of the Energy Committee, but was it as prominent back then, or is this now it's just more on the news because it's more accessible?
Well, Russia has had these enormous gas reserves in oil for many years, and in fact, when we back during, it started with the Carter administration and went on through the Reagan administration. And the idea was if we're going to knock out the Soviet Union, how do we do it? And we did it, we had a triumvirate of things. The first thing we did is we drove down crude prices to $11 well, very cheaply, even cheaper than that, $11 a barrel. It was cheaper even than that, as I remember. And then in addition to that, we also started a false war in Afghanistan, which I was very much involved in. And we did to them in Afghanistan what they did to us in Vietnam. And in addition, we created this entirely false thing, which was called the whole space, the idea that you could shoot down the opponent's rockets in space. And we forced them to put billions and billions and billions of rubles into basically totally false and idiotic technologies. And we basically bankrupted them between those three things and brought them down. And I'm very glad that we brought down the Soviet Union, but the mistake that happened afterwards was instead of helping them westernize, we sent in a bunch of Harvard economists who totally screwed up their economy and allowed a bunch of basically mafioso to buy the economy a penny on the dollar. But I'm not sure in this sense, Frederic, that I'm answering your question.
No, we're just having a conversation.
Yeah, I know.
You run for office in Montana for governor?
For U.S. Senator.
U.S. Senator.
Yeah.
What was the motivation? Because if you like climbing and doing all your activity and traveling, it feels a bit out of your path, no? Unless it was just something else you had to put on your resume?
Oh, no. Life is too short to waste 5 minutes doing what you don't
why
want
doing
to do.
that?
Well, it came because I was a mountain climber, and because I was crazy about the mountains in Montana, and there was we'd been living there for 2 years, and we had moved from California to there, so we raised our kids in a more rural environment, and there was a U.S. Senator named John Melcher who was virulently anti-wilderness and was trying to open all these wilderness areas to logging. And so some people came to me and said, "You're not going to win, but will you run against this guy?" And I said, with 6 weeks to the election, I said, "Sure, why not? We'll kick his ass." But I got 37% of the vote.
Okay.
I took Missoula, I took a number of towns, and I scared the holy bejesus out of him, and he lost the next election. So, and that was instrumental in creating the Lee Metcalf Wilderness Area, which is 2 million acres of the most magnificent landscape on this planet. So that's why I did it. When I pick a war because there's an enemy and I want to defeat him.
So how do you feel now with the climate changes we're experiencing, the green gas effect, or those carbon dioxide in the air, when the forests the ecological clock doesn't seem to be working the same way. Beetles are starting to eat the trees. How do you feel about all that? Because,
very important, very important. There's no doubt. I mean, we're at 400 parts per million now in carbon dioxide, which is, we haven't been there for 2 million years. It's extremely high. It's due principally to automobile and truck exhaust. 70% of it is transit, i.e. truck, and 30% of it, well, it's divided up, 5% of it is cow farts, because we feed cows corn, which causes them to be far more gaseous. But 25% is power plants, mostly coal-fired power plants. But unfortunately, as always with the Obama administration, they pick what is the most financially beneficial to them of choices. And the answer to again, there's 2 parts to the climate equation. One part is transit, and we need to move as quickly as we can to electric vehicles. There's no reason whatsoever.
But why has it been so late? You know,
so late.
So late it has been known for 20 years.
Because it goes against everything. And I'll give you an example, Frederic, on the utility side. Utilities are based on the idea of what's called centralized generation. You generate power in one place, you send it by transmission lines, and then distribution networks eventually to homes. And that's centralized generation, but there's also the new concept is distributed generation, which is you create your electricity on your own roof. And that's what my wife and I do in our homes. And
where's your home? Are you homes?
We have homes in Hawaii, Colorado, Maine, and France, and divide our time between the 4 of them. But
it's not too bad.
No, it's not too bad. You get the best of everything, so to speak. But to return to your question, because it's really crucial, we need to put solar panels on every house, and every home needs to have a car that's electric powered, and that will get rid of 90% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And the other thing we have to do is stop deforestation. When you cut off a forest, like we're cutting through the North American forest right now at great rate, both in the United States and Canada. In China, for instance, 10 years ago, 27% of it was forested. Now 7% is forested.
Is it really that bad?
Yeah, it's terrible. China is the greatest. Well, China and the United States are the 2 greatest environmental criminals on the planet.
Sure.
And even in the Amazon is getting deforested at an astronomical rate. When you take these trees, the moment you cut a tree, it turns into a CO2 producer instead of a CO2 eater. Yeah. And you know all this. This is simple. This is great.
Do you know Jeremy Rifkin?
Yes.
The way you talk, sometimes you sound a bit like him. He's got a
brilliant guy.
He's brilliant, yes.
Yeah.
And I was trying to have it sitting where you're sitting, and I haven't managed yet, but I hope one day it will. And so I was going to ask you, you feel like a lot of what he says is right, but using a computer and then the roof solar panels and the
totally, absolutely right. There is no reason whatsoever. We don't, in our home where we have solar panels, we create excess electricity. And the thing is, if you create electricity, if your car is parked in your garage, you're filling up your car with electricity at night. That car is the battery.
That's right.
And the house feeds on that electricity. You don't need, my wife and I we don't need power poles to our house. We don't need an electric bill. There is no reason for any person in the United States to be connected to a utility, because even in the north, even in Minnesota, for instance, North Dakota and Maine, where it's cold, you have marvelous solar production because the albedo effect, the bouncing of the sunlight off the snow. Yeah, you know all this.
Yeah. Now, something which is a bit I find very interesting about your bio, wind turbine. You're against them.
Totally.
And yet it's clean, it's environmental, and then so tell us why you're against them.
Because it's not clean and it's not environmental.
Okay, so explain it yourself.
Yeah, okay. Very simple. The problem with the wind turbine is that, and I initially was for them till I better understood the engineering. The problem is that wind is very erratic and constantly, even by second, it goes up and down. And you need, in order to keep a constant flow of power into the grid 60 times a second. You cannot change. That has to be constant. If it's not constant, then what you need is a fossil fuel power plant to back it up, to even out that flow into the grid. Or you can cook your grid, or you have brownouts, all kinds of stuff. Mostly you cook your grid. So you have to be very careful. And what happens, because wind is so erratic, is that every single wind project has to have a fossil fuel backup plant. And or somewhere down the line where that power is going has to have a fossil fuel backup plant. And as a consequence, countries that have given themselves over to wind power, like England now has several thousand wind turbines, their purchases of coal, their utilization of coal for power generation has gone up 30% in the last 2 years. Germany, 40% in the last 2 years. The state of Massachusetts, given itself over to wind turbines, is now buying coal wherever it can find it. And not only that, but also because wind turbines happen to be, in most cases, put on mountaintops far from the center of where they're needed, you have a huge transmission loss. In addition, you have to keep that turbine going even if there's no wind. So you have to buy power. And like in the state of Maine, which is being ravaged by wind turbines right now, not for Maine. Maine is 50% green. It's for all the southern New England states don't want to have turbines on their hills and ruin their property values and their health and everything else. They're building them in Maine, and by the time you get that grid, that power all the way down to Connecticut from Maine, you can't even fry an egg with it. And that's just the beginning of what's wrong. It's a huge scam that only benefits investment banks and energy companies. And I must say,
GE or...
yeah, and most of the wind turbine producers are overseas. I must say, having worked my tail off for Barack Obama in the first election and maxed out on contributions, he has probably been the worst environmental president we've ever had. And one of the biggest crimes, he took $178 million in his first campaign from the wind companies, and he rewarded them with billions and billions of dollars in subsidies, which is part of the reason why we now have an $18 trillion national debt. I am totally for renewable energy. I worked for Al Gore. I was the head of business leaders for Gore in several states. I spoke for the vice president on renewable energy. But wind turbines are a huge scam. And what happens is the taxpayer pays for them. The wind energy people get rich. They feed part of this money back to environmental groups like the Sierra Club, which took $28 million from the natural gas industry for not criticizing fracking. Now they're taking millions and millions from the wind industry. And it's a whole huge scam. Yeah. Solar panels on everybody's roof and get rid of the utilities.
I don't know how we got there from your book and the House of Jaguar and the Holy War. But to close the chapter on energy, like fracking is a big issue in the States, given the contamination in water and on the wells. What's your position on that?
I think fracking is sometimes okay and sometimes wrong. It depends on the relationship of the gas field. I'm talking about the subterranean gas field, the relationship to fresh water, to other issues, whether it's going to cause depression in the soils. In some cases, I think it's good. Basically, we have to stop using gas as a power generator. There's no need to use gas for power generation. Again, solar panels on everybody's roof. Gas is enormously overused, and I, having participated in the construction of a number of combined cycle gas power plants, I have to say, if you get to 48, 50% efficiency, you're very high, and that means an enormous amount gets wasted. But I've been on platforms, off-sea oil platforms, and we flared all the time. You had to flare. You ran an enormous flame off the top of your tower. And I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of gas every 24 hours. You had to run that flame, otherwise the whole damn thing could explode. You had to that was the exit.
To release the pressure.
Yeah, right.
So what's your next book?
Next book?
Something on oil and fracking and
I have a book I'm working on that's on the oil business and Russia.
Non-fiction? Fiction?
Oh, everything I do now is fiction.
Okay.
But my next book, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to spend a lot of time, as I said, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, in these wars. And it's called Assassins. It's coming out in the fall. And it's about the last 30 years from when we enticed the Russians into Afghanistan in 1980, and then 2 years later started bringing in surface-to-air missiles and bled them dry, which is what our initial plan was. It was a horrendous war. I remember Kabul. It's hard to believe, but I remember when the girls were listening to Elvis Presley and wearing jeans, and there was not a veil to be seen anywhere. And we are partially responsible for that, because we are the ones who brought fundamentalist Islam into Afghanistan. So that's the subject of my next book, and most of my books relate to military subjects because I'm very close to vets. I spend a lot of time with our American military in very dangerous situations. I love our
Yeah,
country.
like in Guatemala, right? You were the last
Yeah.
one to leave.
I was the last guy out. The last guy. In fact, it's really funny. When I realized that I was going to be next to be killed, I'd been hiding out on the coast in a little fishing village, and I made my way back to Guatemala City. And the death squads, which were horrible, as I said, they kill 50 people, 60 people a day. Anybody who could
You
read
just
and
pick
write.
people off the street and
Well, if you worked in the media, if you were a newspaper,
Yeah.
You were dead. If you were a priest or a nun, or if you were a lawyer or a writer or anybody, if you wore glasses, that meant you might be reading, and they would kill you for that. But I managed to get to the airport, Guatemala City Airport, which is it's not what it used to be, but and they wouldn't take my visa. And there was nothing wrong with my visa. It was a glitch, early computer days. And the last time I had left the United States, prior to this time in Guatemala, I'd received in the mail an American Express card, just, a promotional thing. I didn't have any use for it. I absentmindedly stuck it in my wallet. And so the clerk, he says to me, and then the death squad's on their way, to the airport. And I'm reasonably concerned about this, as you can well imagine. And he says, "Do you have an American Express card?" And I think, oh yeah, I have one. And I pull it out, and it worked. And I got out 15 minutes before they would have killed me.
never
to
leave home
Mexico
without
City.
it.
I'm sorry?
Never leave home without it.
Never leave home without it. And I've never told the Amex people that, but it's God's honest truth. And
Wow.
I've had many, many, many close encounters with death, and that was one of the close ones.
Yeah, and it seems like you've been doing okay with that. So
Oh, yeah. This will get over. It was just a fall. I actually fallen off. This arm is much worse than the other one because
Well, my guest was Mike Bond, and we were very pleased to have you. We could talk for hours just listening to your stories. A new book, Holy War, and thank you for being on Books du Jour.
Thank you, Frederic. It's been an honor.